Okay, welcome to the Arcanum Experiment workshop. I first got interested in the Arcanum Experiment, which is an ancient Egyptian experiment or demonstration when I was researching for my book, The Emerald Tablet. And there were references to a chemical experiment that demonstrated the principles of the Emerald Tablet, and there were also references to specific ingredients in this experiment that represent certain phrases in the Emerald Tablet. And there were historians and some people who actually suggested that the Emerald Tablet was based on this experiment, on what unfolds in the experiment. So I researched and found that there's very little on the Arcanum Experiment. There's some writing by an Egyptian scribe in Alexandria named Manetho, M-A-N-E-T-H-O, and he described the Arcanum Experiment as generating light and transformation to those who viewed it. There was an initiation ritual that he suggested was actually performed in the King's Chamber in the Pyramid of Cheops. And then there was Herodotus had mentioned an experiment, a demonstration of the principles of the Emerald Tablet. The person who researched the Tablet experiment the most was a German alchemist by the name of Dr. Gottlieb Latz, L-A-T-Z. And he was actually a 19th century physician alchemist. And he put most of his life into trying to find out the ingredients of the experiment and to apply them medicinally. And all the ingredients that we're going to talk about have medicinal uses in the history of alchemy. And they've all been used for healing and many different modalities, from leprosy and sexually transmitted diseases to bowel obstructions, upset stomach. I mean, these were the major medicines of ancient times too. And Dr. Latz translated a lot of Russian documents and Latin documents in his search for the Emerald Tablet. He ended up writing a book called Alchemy, De Alchemy, and it's a huge book. It's like 500,000 words, that big. And so I had to translate most of it. It's in German, and I've written just a short little summary of the parts that dealt with the Emerald Tablet in The Secret of the Emerald Tablet, which is at the bookstore. And I'm working on a much bigger book now that I've had 10 years of research to do on this experiment and trying to figure out how it evolved and what were the ingredients and stages of the experiment. Again, this experiment is based on the Emerald Tablet and the different phrases in the Emerald Tablet. The tablet goes back to ancient Egypt. We know it was known in Alexandria, and it was probably known before that in the Leyden papyrus, and also the German number 3 papyrus, they call it. There are actually phrases in these ancient Egyptian texts from 1500 BC and earlier that are phrases right out of the Emerald Tablet. So there's good evidence, I think, that it's an ancient document, although most scholars date it to an Arabian text from about 800 AD, which it's actually an appendix to a book on advice to kings. And what happened was, and why there's no previously existing versions of the Emerald Tablet, is that Alexandria Library was burnt by Christians and Arabians and Romans, and so there was virtually nothing left of it. But some of these documents made their way into Arabia, and that's where our source document for the Emerald Tablet is. It just that because it dates, the book itself dates from 800, doesn't mean that the Emerald Tablet dates from 800. And you can have endless arguments with scholars about this, but that is the first existing translation of it. And it made its way into Europe with the invasions of the Arabs into Morocco and Spain. And from there, it became very much appreciated by alchemists. About 1300 AD, the Emerald Tablet was published in Europe. alchemists had a copy of the tablet on their laboratory walls. And almost all alchemists had it in their laboratory, again signifying that there was some type of connection with lab work. Isaac Newton had a copy of the Emerald Tablet and followed its precepts. In fact, he rewrote the Emerald Tablet to fit his own experiments. So I think there's a lot of evidence that this is a chemical document and a spiritual document, that it's about transformation, about the universal principles of transformation, and how they can apply on all three levels of reality: the spiritual, the material, the mental, and how our consciousness can be involved in experiment. So the principles of the Emerald Tablet are, I believe, universal. Quantum physicists pick out things in the Emerald Tablet that make sense to them about the view of the Emerald Tablet and science, modern science. So the Emerald Tablet, in particular, talking about the ingredients of the experiment. Its father is the sun and mother the moon. This is referring to a sulfuric acid, which is an acid from the material you're holding in your hand. Sulfur is like the 10th most abundant element in the universe, and it's instrumental in industrialization and transformations of all kinds, not only in the laboratory but throughout the world. The wind carries it in its belly, refers to an ingredient, a powder, in the experiment. They considered a powder associated with air because powders are suspended in air, like smoke particles, and powders we blow on talcum powder, it's in the air. So then there's actually rituals and ceremonies where you blow powder into the air. So the powder here was called powder of the sun, or Pulvis Solaris, and that represented the air element, and the earth element was represented by natron, referring here to its mother is the earth, its nurse is the earth. And natron is another material in alchemy that was used since ancient times. So basically, we've got this scheme as far as understanding what the ingredients of the Emerald Tablet experiment was. And the first ingredients, father of the sun, was vitriol, which is sulfuric acid. And vitriol was the basic acid, the first usable acid in alchemical experiments. Its mother, the moon, refers to liquor HEPATIS, which means liquor of the soul, or liqueur of the soul. And Egyptians were very, very fond of liquor HEPATIS. And it smells like rotten eggs. It has kind of a very powerful rotten egg smell that penetrates your nostrils. And it's repugnant to most modern people, but the Egyptians believed it was like a perfume. And they wore it like perfume. And they stunk like rotten eggs. But it just shows you that they associated this smell with something sacred, with something profound and worth honoring by wearing and becoming part of it. And then Pulvis Solaris was the powder, and Pulvis Solaris was made of two different powders, red Pulvis Solaris and black Pulvis Solaris, and we'll talk about those and how to make them later. And natron, which is also composed of two chemicals, sodium carbonate and sodium nitrate, primarily. And natron is earth. It's the material you see on dried lake beds. That white material that you see, that's almost pure sodium carbonate. And that was readily available. Just south of Alexandria is a lake called Natron Lake, or dried lake, where that was their source of this chemical. And vitriol is also composed of two things, sulfuric acid and iron. So you have four main major arcana: vitriol, liquor HEPATIS, Pulvis Solaris, and natron. And then you have 7 minor arcana: sulfuric acid, iron, liquor of the soul, liquor HEPATIS, red Pulvis Solaris, black Pulvis Solaris, sodium carbonate, and sodium nitrate. So these are the 7 ingredients. These ingredients that you see here were carried down in many different ancient traditions. They became part of the tarot tradition, which is a whole other lecture, but the way these chemicals behave individually and together carried significance in that the characteristics of the chemicals were like mythologized by the Egyptians, that these were archetypal powers coming down into our reality and that they played out in experiments. We'll talk more about that. All of them were used as medicines. Spirit of vitriol was used for many different things. It was a dilute oil of sulfuric acid. The black Pulvis Solaris was used, put in distilled water, dissolved in distilled water, and about eight of these different products that came that you hear. Everyone on here, as a matter of fact, looking at them, were used for a specific purpose. And my research has led me to believe that people in the Middle Ages, especially, and probably all the way back to Egypt, were pretty severely constipated most of the time, because these are all have that laxative effect, and people felt cleansed by these. They're called cathartics. Pure mercury, Chinese still to this day drink pure mercury as a laxative because it's fast moving through the system because of its weight. So it was a real big problem back then. Even Paracelsus in his experiments talking about some of these, the one he talks about the most is Senna, which is Senecot, the modern laxative has it in it. And he praised it like it was the Philosopher's Stone, honestly. And just went on and on about it. So the idea here is cleansing and transformation. And they also were bacteriostatic. They protected people from diseases. Sulfur is a miracle drug, and they knew it back then. They sprinkled it on wounds. It speeds healing. There's hundreds of different sulfur drugs that developed in the early 20th century that were the most powerful drug for treating wounds and infections that there was at the time. Natron was used for everything from upset stomachs to purification of the blood and things like that. Spirits of ammonia and vitriol, all used for different types of sicknesses and illnesses. And so they were respected in that regard too. And whether that originated from the emerald tablet and association with the emerald tablet, or just through accidental use of some type, people believed that these were miracle cures. Vitriol, okay, the first ingredient we're talking about, sulfuric acid, the most important ingredient in this experiment, is a naturally occurring substance too. It's, you can see natural vitriol over there in the left-hand corner. It's a solid green chunk of kind of glass-like, that's where the word vitriol comes from, that you can almost see through it. And you can find vitriol in nature. It grows from sulfur-bearing rock that's aged or weathered. So if it goes through a lot of rain and wind and sunlight, this wonderful green substance starts oozing out near the rock or the bottom of the rock. And I know where to get vitriol in California around Sacramento, but you can find it anywhere where there's like an old housing project where they were pouring concrete and the business went bankrupt or something, and there's still these big piles of hard gray rocks that they use in mixing concrete. And there's more and more sites like that nowadays to be found. And after 5 or 10 years, these weathered rocks down at the bottom, you'll find greenish, whitish, kind of foamy fluid coming out the bottom. And if it sits long enough, it will dry out and harden. And usually that means up in the rock somewhere there's a bigger pool of it. And you just scoop that up, and that's green vitriol. It's the green lion in alchemy, a very important substance. And that's what the alchemists in ancient times, in the Middle Ages, that's originally where they found this material. And if you distill that material, you get oil of vitriol. Those are some scenes of heating and distilling and condensing the vapors from green vitriol. Extremely important chemical in alchemy, associated with the green lion, called the green lion, sometimes the green dragon in Chinese. A powerfully significant example or idea of the first matter, or that matter that can become anything, especially something full of chaotic energy. Sulfur itself is also found naturally around volcanoes. It comes spewing up from the earth. Sulfur pools and baths, giving out sulfuric acid and also sulfur. There's a natural sulfur cycle in nature, which is involved about deterioration and death and decay and putrefaction. That's where sulfur becomes most active. So sulfur is part of the Solway phase, or the dissolution phase of alchemy. It's something that dissolves the current structure, and it will dissolve you very quickly. Sulfur has an affinity for flesh that it instantly, in the lab, if you spill it on it, there's almost no time to get to water to flush it off, because it just burns away flesh until it wears out and exposes bone. So when you see like skulls or bones in alchemy, it's referring to the use of sulfuric acid in experiments. A perfect way to get rid of a body is a vat of sulfuric acid. If you dump a body in there, this is useful knowledge, maybe, I don't know. That the flesh dissolves almost within 5 minutes, and then within a week or so, the bones are gone too. Sulfur is very interesting, the material that you've got there. If you light it or heat it, it's called brimstone, so it very much has an affinity with fire and the sun and light. It gives off a light always when it's burning, even though that's not visible. To see the really blue liquid flame, which is quite beautiful of sulfur, you have to turn off the lights to be able to see it. So very significant. Sulfuric acid was the engine that drove the Industrial Revolution. The country was judged by how much sulfuric acid it produced as how modern it was. And the United States led for many, many years, and Great Britain. But this material also is a pollutant. And growing up near Gary, Indiana, I don't know if any of you know about that, but it's a steel mill town. And sulfuric acid fumes were coming up in the atmosphere quite often there, and there was a lot of pollution coming from the mills. And I remember this cloud here is sulfuric oxide, this red cloud that comes up around steel mills and places that process sulfuric acid and sulfur. My father had just recited the house, I remember when I was about 14, with aluminum siding, spent thousands of dollars. And a week later, there was an emission of the sulfuric oxide that turned our whole house pink. And believe me, and it took years and years to get reconstitution, in court. There was a class action suit, but it's a nasty but wonderful chemical that has to be respected. It's a dragon in alchemy. It's like working with the first matter. You never know what it's going to do. And vitriol is the other component of green vitriol. Iron is the element that comes out of this, also therapeutic. Iron has this red color to it. Iron pyrite has a golden color, mistaken for gold often. That's iron oxide. There's scenes of mining vitriol and sulfur and iron there from Egypt all the way through the Middle Ages. Iron appears red, but when you wash it, as you can see in the picture there, it actually has this bluish-green color. And that bluish-green color is where the color of vitriol comes from this iron color. But if it's allowed to sit out, it forms this layer of iron oxide, which is rust, and then it has this red appearance. Liquor HEPATIS is the other arcanum, major arcanum. It's hydrogen sulfide primarily. Hydrogen sulfide comes up from the earth. It's like the bowels of hell, as it's been described, opening up and breathing and exhaling. It's a very dangerous chemical, rotten smell of eggs, but it'll fill up a room. If you smell hydrogen sulfide, they say, very strong, or it's biting your nose, you've got about 4 minutes to get away from it, because you'll die. The hydrogen sulfide numbs your nerves in your nose, and you can't smell it anymore. and you don't know it's there, and within 10 minutes it replaces the oxygen in your lungs and you die. Many miners died this way, which is why they had canaries and things like that in mines to detect this. Very, very powerful. It runs in rivers under the water, in fresh water, and some lakes. There are periodic emissions of hydrogen sulfide that kill hundreds of people around the lakes. It's very spooky to be underwater and see this white stream flowing underneath you very slowly, very heavy stuff. It's one of the most powerful ingredients in alchemy, and one of the most significant as far as being associated with death. Remember I told you the whole sulfur cycle is associated with death, and this is the death gas, if you wish to look at it that way. But death in alchemy is not a bad thing always. Death is part of the work, death to our old selves, whatever level you're working on. In the laboratory, it's death of the old substance, and you want to break down that substance, whether it's a herb or a mineral or a metal, into its essences and reveal the essences within it. So everything has to die This is a postcard from Alberta, Canada. How would you like to be going down a street with, say, no breathing at any time? I don't know. It's a hydrogen sulfide plant in Alberta, and again, industry doesn't know how to handle these things. Sulfuric acid was to ancient alchemists and ancient peoples like atomic energy is today to us. And they really didn't know how to handle it first. And there were many, many accidents because it was condensed energy. It added energy to experiments, and was deadly and dangerous, and was difficult to work with. Liquor HEPATIS is also composed of ammonia. Ammonia is the chemical of life, as opposed to hydrogen sulfide, which is the chemical of death. Ammonia is, of course, a fertilizer in our own bodies, and in many ways, nitrogen compounds, especially ammonia, are part of the life cycle, not part of that sulfur cycle. So ammonia was respected by the Egyptians and alchemists as a life-giving substance, life itself. Paracelsus used ammonia and liquor HEPATIS to try and create the homunculus, the little creature that he could create from chemicals. Nitrogen compounds were a major part of that. Ammonia is named after the Egyptian god Ammon, or Amen, and he was a blue god, and ammonia has this blue color in its liquids. It also removes blue colors from different things, like on the bottom there, I believe that's hawthorn wool. A hawthorn is a plant with a deep blue color, lapis blue color, but ammonia will turn it red. And these are fabric that were a deep blue, lapis blue color, favorite of the Egyptians, that would turn it this yellow color, this golden yellow color. Egyptians thought that was significant in their theology. Now, Pulvis Solaris is the powder, and it's also composed of two ingredients, red Pulvis Solaris, and that's a mercury compound. It's a mercury oxide. Oddly, mercury oxide occurs in two parts, and it's like a signature of mercury actually to be double-faced. In fact, the word that alchemists used for mercury was the rebis, R-E-B-I-S, which means the two-headed thing, the thing that comprised or composed, conjoined the opposites. And that's what mercury does in all its behaviors. In the powder form, it has a therapeutic red form, which is a very healing substance, part of like mercurochrome and other materials. On the right, you see white mercury oxide, which is a deadly poison. Just a teaspoon would kill everyone in this room, like in 15 minutes. It's extremely poison. And the alchemists gradually learned that over time. The red Pulvis Solaris was associated with snakes also for some reason. I've turned that up many, many times in Egypt, no explanation why, but I think it has to do with the fact that red Pulvis Solaris and clumps up with black Pulvis Solaris, or actually sulfur and mercury clump up in an immediate marriage. And in fact, the best way to clean up a mercury spill is just to sprinkle sulfur over it, because it forms balls and you can sweep it up. The Egyptians, oddly, believed that these balls of mercury were therapeutic. And in their mummification, they found these balls in the two serpents in the body, according to the Egyptian text. They believed that the intestines was a serpent in the body, and they believed the brain was a serpent in the body. The brain looks like it's all coiled up too. And they found accretions of undigested matter and inorganic compounds and things like that. Again, I thought they were constipated, and this is another symbol of it. These are bezoars, B-E-Z-O-A-R-S, and they're these little balls, very hard, solid balls that formed in the intestines of ancient peoples. You don't see them anymore for some reason, but probably because we have Senecot. But when they found them in the intestines, they thought there was something sacred. They thought they were a stone, something significant, so they became medicines, very expensive medicines reserved for the pharaoh. And in the Middle Ages, they were sold in Europe too, to kings. And in later Egypt, there's not much evidence of this, but around the Renaissance for sure, it was discovered that in the serpent in the head, there were also bezoars and in the pineal gland. And there are little solid black specks of matter, little balls of black specks. They're very tiny. But if you take the pineal gland, which is shaped like a pine cone, and you peel it back, and instead of seeds in there, it has all these hundreds of little black particles. So those became worth lots and lots of money to alchemists and kings and people who believed in the transformative powers of the stone, or the which originated as an organic bezoar. There's a lot on the pineal gland. If you're interested in bodily transformation, you should really look at the literature on the pineal gland. It's amazing and fascinating subject. When we were on all fours as animals, the pineal gland was up in the front of our forehead, like the ajna, or the third eye. But as we became upright, as apes became upright and orientated ourselves on this vertical axis of reality, the pineal gland actually moved to the center of the head, deep in the fourth ventricle of the brain, to orientate itself over time to light, like a flower would, because these little crystals are sensitive to light, and they're buried deep in the brain. And there's just tons of fascinating stuff out there about the pineal gland and how it's related to spirituality. Rudolf Steiner and many scientists of the Renaissance and 19th century especially felt that the key to spirituality and transformation lie in the pineal gland. So the Egyptians knew about this, and they associated mercury and red Pulvis Solaris with snakes. Mercury is, of course, the first matter par excellence. Really, it has no shape, and it reflects what is around it. It has no identity. It's associated with light and light effects. It's the source of the whitest light we have, and you can see it in mercury vapor lights. Mercury, too, has this double aspect about being a poison in the environment, too. When I was young, we lived in Chicago in a tenement house. I think I was about 12 years old. I went in the basement one day, and they had this huge gas meter, and a technician had been down there repairing it, and he left about a 4-pound pile of mercury on the floor. And of course, I was fascinated by it, and I scooped it up and took it and played with it and ran it around my mouth, and just to love the feeling I can still feel it under my tongue, wonderful cold, and I squished it between my teeth, and like a mouthwash almost. And then I showed it to my friends, and we started playing with it. We just played with it constantly, and we even took mercury dimes, which were silver back then, and silver has an affinity, of course, with mercury, and we rub the dimes with mercury, and they take on this beautiful, shiny, like slippery feeling because the mercury had bonded with the silver, and then we put them back into circulation, and we did that to hundreds of dimes. I mean, we'd be terrorists today if we were caught doing it. But I don't think there were any effects on looking back. I don't know. I think mercury transformed me in a strange way. I became more intellectual, I guess. Certainly more interested in mathematics and things like that. My IQ went up as far as the testing is concerned. And yet mercury is associated with a poison, with retardation. So there's an affinity for the brain in mercury that we don't fully understand. Although, let's see if I got this. I'm going to postpone that thought and just show you a side that mercury is considered a religious and transformational thing in the Indian religion, where they have mercury pills. They drink different kinds of mercury. They have hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of mercury compounds that are ingested. This is the yellow lingam, it's called, is made of sulfur, and the metal of the phallic thing above it there is a solid mercury, or solidified mercury, which is mercury with silver, I believe, although they're very secretive about what it is. But it's totally neutralized when you put it on this sulfur altar. No fumes come off of it. It turns black just like sulfur and mercury when you mix them. And they have sulfur amalgams of this Shiva lingam. The idea here is that mercury unites the above and the below. You know, remember the stance of Hermes is always about as above, so below. And mercury embodies that idea. So they do a lot of prayer rituals, drinking or taking distilled water, sacred water, and putting it in the top and letting it drip down on the Shiva lingam stone. And when this stone is made of mercury, as here, the water drips down and then it's recirculated. So it's kind of a spiritual distillation that's going on, that they're trying to make part of a ritual. That if you combine the powers of mercury, because it's connected to the above and below, you can have the powers of the above and below, both the divine and the earthly powers. That's the idea behind that. And Pulvis Solaris is also composed of black Pulvis Solaris, which is antimony. So it's pretty simple. You take antimony and just grind it up, hammer it, and grind it down to a powder, and that produces black antimony. When you mix that with a substance called sulfur auratum, you create a higher form of sulfur, and it combines very rapidly and forms black Pulvis Solaris. We'll go through that in the laboratory. And natron is these salts that form on lake beds all over the world. Egypt has a lot of them because of the environment, because of the fluctuations in the Nile. You can just go out there, and this stuff is almost 100% sodium carbonate. There's also a lot of sodium nitrate. And then if you go just below the surface, this white surface, you get lots of trace elements. And we'll go through that in the laboratory work because these become very important. When I decided to do the experiment, or reproduce the experiment, I do make many trips to Egypt, and I wanted to use the actual ingredients that the Alexandrians would have used. So I spent a lot of time scraping things off the playas and dried lake beds in Egypt, especially around Alexandria, where the experiment was first performed, and smuggling it back into the United States in my luggage. And, it's heavy material, and it has a wonderful clean smell, kind of like kitchen cleanser, to be out there on that in nature like that. Very few things grow there, and it kills any life that's around there simply because it doesn't have a lot of nitrogen in it to support growth of plants. This is wabi, and it's Alexandria's up here. This isn't very bright, but sorry. Alexandria's up here, so this lake here is the source of natron for the experiments. Here's a scene from Europe of alchemists taking natron from a dried lake bed. Even today in Egypt, they bag natron right from the dried lake beds into these big sacks and carry it back. And natron still has a lot of uses, especially in Egyptian religion and ceremonies, where it becomes the ingredient or the purified salt that makes the afterlife possible. And that's key to understanding the alchemy of natron. Natron is a salt, an associate with salts, and yet it embodies both the impure salt at the beginning of the work, or in the metallic terms, the lead, and it embodies the perfected salt, or the stone, at the end of the work, which is gold in the metallic mythology. So they used it to dry out the mummy and to purify the mummy. They included little sacks of natron with the corpse, believing that the natron would allow the mummy to come back to life, to be resurrected. This was actually found in King Tutankhamun's tomb. So we should take a moment to understand the mythology here about these compounds, about vitriol, which is the energy in us, our passion, the things that make us burn, our anger, all those things that excite us, all those emotions that are like the first matter in us. That's the connection that Egyptians and later alchemists made too. The alchemists, during the Arcanum Experiment, there was meditation going on, trying to invoke the experiment, trying to make themselves part of it because the changes would take part in them. And natron was super important because it embodied the idea of materialization. So you take and you dissolve the lower body, the corrupt body, our human bodies, who are caught in this metabolism fire that eventually will destroy us, and make this new salt within us a body of light in the Egyptian teachings, a resurrected body of light, the higher salt and higher natron. So natron was and salt in alchemy, as it became later one of the three principles of alchemy. Salt embodies both this idea of the corrupt body and the perfected body. And it's both about materialization. So that the implication here is that alchemy is not about doing this spiritual work like most spiritual traditions are, where you try to become more and more spiritual and get higher and higher and higher, increase the vibrations. And there are many, many ways, and we'll see some about how to achieve that. But alchemy always has a turning point, and it goes back to earth. It returns to earth. That the idea is you go to heaven to receive the purified energy, but you recrystallize it on earth in a new body. And the work is done on earth. You don't live in heaven. You don't go to heaven to hang around for eternity or whatever different religious traditions have. So that's what got alchemy in trouble with the priest and all down through the ages. It's a definite trend in alchemy to destroy and create this new body. And the new body is this throne of the macabre, the thing that is going to carry us through time and space. And it's very clear in the Egyptian teachings and also in the Renaissance teachings of the philosophical alchemist, that there's a body to be created and it's back here on earth. And that idea also incorporated both the light and the dark. So we got this vertical axis of reality, the material and the energetic, or the physical and the spiritual realms. And you have this left and right axis too in alchemy, called the horizontal axis, where you've got this division into polarities of like masculine and feminine, passive and aggressive. Everything breaks down like that too. And It's the bringing together of these at that center point where the final conjunction or the stone is created, whether it be a new personality, a new identity, a new confidence, some type of creative insight in the work you're doing. If you work like that, trying to combine above and below and left and right, in other words, left and right as a writer, I can tell you that that's logic and intuition. That's feelings and thoughts. And if you don't bring those together in your writing, then you're going to be a failure, because people know that when something's real, it's going to have both components. And you have to combine emotion and thoughts. And you have to combine feeling and logic and masculine and feminine. You see how those come together. That's the king and the queen in alchemy. And it's a great secret in alchemy about how to work on all different levels. Psychologically, Carl Jung knew it. Tom Cavalli, one of our speakers here, worked with him on his book, Alchemical Psychology, very clear methods. Edward Edinger is another Jungian psychologist. That's the method in depth psychology, about integrating your personality, integrating in this, they don't call it the stone, but that's what it is. That's what the ancients called it. So that's the inner work, but it's also the laboratory work. So you want to do the same thing in the laboratory, and distillation is about bringing together the above and the below, and the left and the right, about positive and negative energies. Like red Pulvis Solaris is a masculine driving type energy, black Pulvis Solaris, and just about anything black is associated with the soul and the darkness and the unknowability about the soul, the unconscious, as opposed to the rational light of consciousness. But those have to come together into a state that the Egyptians called intelligence of the heart, a really purified state of intuition that is an altered state of consciousness, really, that's very balanced and very much a mental conjunction. So that's natron. And again, the Pulvis Solaris, powders of the sun, those are the ingredients that are in the air. In other words, they're halfway between earth and heaven. They're bringing down the energies from heaven above and crystallizing them into earth below. So that's a process of bringing the divine to the below. Liquor HEPATIS is a rising gas, ammonia and hydroxide, and that's a connection between the below and the above, or a rising type action. And these are combined in the actions of distillation. So you bring together the energies above and the energies below, which are physical and spiritual, or energy and matter. And it's the same idea that, and quantum physicists and my friends in science are very excited about alchemical principles as they're being clarified now in these modern times, because it's the same thing as E equals mc squared. Energy equals matter times light. And the light of consciousness is very much what alchemists work with. They call it the true imagination sometimes, but very specific terms, meaning a purified consciousness. In other words, energy and matter are the same thing. We know that from physics, and we know that from alchemy too. And the physicists would tell you that light is the thing that determines the quantity of energy you get from matter, or the quantity of matter you get from condensing energy. And the alchemists would tell you that it's the light of consciousness. How focused and concentrated can become your inner light, or your projected light, into manifesting your desires. So it's the same thing on many other levels, and I'll talk more about that science in the keynote lecture on Sunday. That's the other one, sorry. This is sodium nitrate, which is also a big part of the natron. And again, that represents the darker salt, if you will, and also the nitrate represents the life principle coming out of the darkness into the light. The Egyptians associate this with the sunset. Sodium nitrate and sodium carbonate, they associate with the sunrise. That this was breaking light in the morning, sodium carbonate, and that this was the setting light at night, which is associated with the soul. So even back in Egypt, we saw this bringing together of the light and the dark parts of everything. And that's how they divided things into polarities. They looked at it that way. And in alchemy and even in ancient times, the the dark part of our personality or our experiences, that was part of the experience. It wasn't to be pushed away. And you see many New Age traditions, again, wanting to go to the light all the time and becoming part of the light. And yet that's only half the equation, because the power resides often in the darkness and the things that you don't know about. And pushing towards the light becomes kind of an empty gesture unless you're rooted in the darkness. It's so refreshing to read the writings of alchemists in the Renaissance who talked about not rejecting depression and mental dark states, yet that was an opportunity to get great insight, great energy projected. And that to work with depression, to work with those dark times, that was just as valid as being euphoric, being enthusiastic. And bringing them together was where the secret of transformation lied, on the mental level, in your psychology. So, you know, an alchemist would never take a Prozac, just write it out. And I have to admit that there probably are clinical, chemical states of depression that should be treated, and yet, which came first? You know, is it the materialization of the chemicals in the brain that cause depression, or is it that's part of the alchemical process that it has to be physically expressed? So all these ideas about spirituality just being up there, alchemists never looked for it up there. They look for it in a chemical, in a hormone, in some type of physical expression. And some scientists come along and they look at just the physical expression and they say that's the cause of it. And yet, I don't think that's true. And there's lots of arguments there for scientists to talk about. Okay, we're coming up close to a break, and are there any questions or anything that you want to talk about? No, cinnabar is definitely talked about a lot in alchemy. It's the union of mercury and sulfur. It's the mineral, mercury sulfide is the name of it, and it's a beautiful rock that's very much considered a religious artifact in China. It's white quartz usually with a red crystal of mercury in it. And if you take cinnabar rocks and you just put them over a fire and roast them, mercury will come dripping out. Pure mercury will become dripping out of the bottom of it. So cinnabar is a combination, the perfect union of sulfur and mercury. And that's the way the metals were discovered, you know. People would be around a fire, and that's when alchemy started. I mean, in prehistoric times when there was nothing but trees and mountains and sand and dirt and rivers and nothing artificial, nothing but nature. You know, we weren't just part of nature, we were nature. And there was nothing else on our horizon in our mentality. And yet, by discovering the metals in their bonfires dripping out like from cinnabar, or they built a fire near a lead ore, and the glistening lead metal would come dripping out down into the fire. What a miraculous experience to see that for someone who'd never seen it before. That's why metals became the big secret, you know, and people who know how to transform and smelt metals and bring this totally weird, artificial looking substance, the metals, into reality and to be able to work with them. That was a great secret, and that's the secret roots of alchemy. But it transformed this world like nothing else. I mean, people have a hard time understanding why alchemists are so fascinated with the metals. And it's all about the metals transformed us. The metals are the archetypes of the planets, the 7 archetypes, the 7 arcana. They carry those 7 heavenly principles of organization, of universal patterns. And that's why they were like a gift from the gods to the alchemists, because if they could understand the metals, they could understand the divine energies and how to use them. And metals, I mean, what would we do without metals in this world? You know, there'd be no modern culture. We'd still be living in one-story huts made of trees or mud or something. So it transformed the world, but the alchemists also believe they transformed us, transformed our spirit. Just by knowing about the metals, transformed us into more sentient, more aware beings. Any other questions? Yeah?
You mentioned about the serpents, intestine and the brain. Where did
Yeah, a lot of the traditions in alchemy came from Alexandria, so and they were exported around the world. The timing is just perfect for Chinese alchemy, for Indian alchemy, and there was a lot of intuition in Indian alchemy, which is the most elaborate and different tree limbs go in all different directions is Indian alchemy. I know a lot of Indian alchemists, and the idea of the serpent corresponds exactly with what the Alexandrian tradition is, that we have in us this serpent, this energy that's coiled up, whether it's the intestines or lower. It's an energetic expression of the life force and the possibility of it unfolding, the evolutionary energy. So in the Indian tradition, the Kundalini is this same energy, the Pulvis Solaris. They even call it that, and they use the same type of compounds to stimulate the chakras. And in fact, well, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but each one of the chakras, from the Muladhara to the Sahasrara, all 7 of these correspond to a metal, all 7 of them correspond to an arcanum, and the Hindu alchemists use these same chemicals to stimulate the different chakras to make that part of evolution. And even in the later tradition, in the Kabbalah, the levels of the Kabbalah in the tree of life correspond to these arcanum or these chemicals. And that's not my work. That's some other people who study the Kabbalah. Yeah.
What about the concept of the serpent representing a feminine energy compared to a frog representing masculine?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Why the serpent is associated with energy, and it's that it's a feminine presence when it's coiled and waiting to be expressed, and that's transformed, and that's this is such a good question, and that's the waveform of a snake, and the traveling of a snake is wave energy, and that's the expression of it. So once the Kundalini starts moving, it becomes expressed in a different way. So once it's potential versus kinetic energy. And in light, we have this same idea that when it's the principle of that light is both matter and energy. That light consists of particles called photons that are hard. They're like billiard balls. They knock each other around and they knock things out. So light is both material, has a material aspect, but it has this wavy aspect too of energy. So light is the perfect combination of energy and matter, which is, light is mercury in alchemy, and it's consciousness. Therefore, there is this combination of these two completely different ways of existence or manifestation in the universe of energy and matter, and they're one. The alchemist phrase when they pictured the snake, especially the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, was all is one. In other words, energy and matter are the same thing, and light incorporates that idea perfectly. Light becomes a particle when you are expecting a particle in an experiment. Light becomes energy or a wave or a spectrum when you are expecting light or energy. When you set up the experiment to detect that, then that's how light expresses itself. That's pure mercury. That's and it really upset the old science. You know, it's how quanta are formed, and how from this vast foam of non-creation comes creation, comes particles, and that, as far as we know now, the only thing that determines that is the consciousness expectation of the observer, or the person's own consciousness. So there's a lot of secrets concealed in secrets, and a lot of myths with great meaning. But I think they're all talking about the same thing, you know. And modern science and work, it seems to be converging, and that's really exciting for me. Yeah, up here.
Yeah, so you see the churches and the establishments of the religions, they were hunting down the alchemists because the religions was all about heavens or going up. But then the alchemist said, no, we have to be rooted in darkness. And then
Absolutely, yeah. Religions, and all the way back to ancient Egypt, the idea that anyone, the main problem was the idea that anyone could reach the divine, that anyone could, through their meditation in their private chambers. In fact, the alchemist Bruno was burnt at the stake in a very horrible, they lit fires in stages so he'd suffer for hours and hours, and burned him alive just for saying one thing, and that was that I can reach the divine in my own chambers. I don't know that he was implying you don't have to go to church. The church is, and I'm not talking about Catholic people and their beliefs, I'm talking about the church. It's a corporation. It's like the first corporation, and they wanted to control the people. They replaced the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire invented corporation ideas with battalions and all, and the church is structured the same way. So the church becomes a blockage or a gateway where they want a toll to go through it. They want control, and they want to be that middleman. So like all corporations, and that's a real problem that the church had, I think, with alchemists. There was one more.
Forgive my ignorance. I'm kind of new to this whole thing, but so the original alchemists, the ones that we have evidence of that had stuff written about, where did they find their knowledge? Was it all experiential, or was it somehow given to them?
I think if we look at the tradition that alchemy began with fire, the discovery of fire and transformation, and the discovery of metals, then it kind of evolved as a craft, and they kept it secret that way. But back then there was no difference between science and religion. They were all one discipline. So they were facing the mystery of matter and the mystery of the universe, and they projected this very pure consciousness into it, and that's where the principles evolved. And then there's the other tradition, which makes more sense than you might think because of some of the ancient records, that this was all given to us all at once. There was an amazing quantum leap in the human intellectual abilities about 40,000 years ago. And it's like civilization just popped up then, especially the Egyptian civilization, which was back to 5,000 BC. And the idea that it was a gift, and that is the idea in the Egyptian tradition, that this was a gift, that these 9 gods came to earth, called the Ennead, which consisted of Thoth and the other Egyptian gods, and they gave us wisdom, knowledge, and awareness. Lots of insinuations that they manipulated DNA, the baboon being associated with Thoth, and the ibis spirit. There's the mythology, the alchemical mythology is really fascinating because it can be taken on so many levels. But embedded in there, if you read that, and I'm the last person in the world to believe in UFOs and aliens, but there is a seed of truth there, that there was some type of manipulation, and it's definitely in the Egyptian text, without a doubt. They talk about the Emerald Tablet itself floating down from heaven and coming in a green light. So those are the two interpretations, and right now I'm in between, and there's really no way, unfortunately. But the evidence is amazing that there was some type of higher intelligence involved there, rather than human evolution. Because I still think, knowing humans, that if they discovered the metals 40,000 years ago, it would take another 4 million years before they got to where we're at, just with politics and arguing and things like that. It was just like there was instant knowledge, and it's very strange. Okay, we should break probably. Take is that a half-hour break?
Yes.
Half-hour break.